Hello, and first of all, let me thank you all for being here, and I want to thank particularly Hushang Amiramati and the great staff of the AIC for putting this together. I think they deserve a little hand. Let's give them a hand. Yeah. Very good. Hushang actually asked me to talk about a theme which is probably more complex than I should have accepted, which is the connection really between human rights and power politics. But in a certain way, this has been my life for the last 15, 20 years, trying to bridge that gap. And it seems, and I'd like to approach this not with a philosophical disquisition or some history going back, that would be impossible, but rather to do something a little different than what's been done, which is to offer a set of criteria for making judgments about which policies one should support. I'm very cynical about human rights interventions, particularly being involved in human rights. What that means is that everyday people, especially, require some, as I say, set of categories, some set of criteria to begin to make a judgment on this or that policy. And it seems to me that from the standpoint of everyday people, and even to a degree from policymakers that I know, human rights and power politics are often seen as diametrically opposed. Human rights is predicated on universal ethics, and while power politics is usually predicated on national aims. Human rights speaks to ideal ends. Power politics is inherently instrumental and speaks to means. Human rights has an ethical dimension that's obvious, while the latter, power politics, is what the word says it is. It's about power, politics, and winning. The former, human rights, is usually seen as an irritant by policymakers. On the other hand, from the standpoint of idealists that I know, and I'm thinking here of certain liberal hawks who supported the Iraqi invasion, and I can tell you that they did that not from the standpoint of interest, but from the standpoint of principle. Power politics, interests are just obstacles that get in the way. Leaving things at this level, at this type of binary opposition, in my view, works to the detriment both of human rights and of forging an intelligent and prudent politics. And let me show why, because everybody says this in some way, but there's a certain justification, I think, that deserves to be stated. If the pursuit of ethical aims is undertaken without reference to interests, empirical conditions, and costs, and above all, efficacy, then the pursuit of human rights becomes blind. It becomes action without purpose. It spins, you would say it spins in the atmosphere, but it's worse than that. The good intentions pave the road to hell. And in a way, for many of my friends, perhaps some of them former friends, who were liberal hawks on Iraq, this has surely been the case. By the same token, the wise guys, and they're all over Washington, human rights, big deal. Yeah, we acknowledge it in the breach. This, I think, is also a mistake. My wife, Ann, and I, we were in Tahrir Square on May Day. It was a remarkable thing, Human rights is an actual politics. And I would make the argument, someone here reminded me of an old prediction I made about the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is true. I did that relatively early. But I can tell you this, that from the standpoint of the lowly and the insulted today, the world over, there's a sense in which human rights has taken the place of the old socialism, the old communism, and it's a real force that needs to be taken seriously. Indeed, simply trumpeting interest in power creates a situation in which, especially for the United States, in a multipolar world, it creates distrust and it creates a situation in which all means become legitimate. And what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If one's willing to say, we can do it because it's in our national interest, then frankly, I don't want to hear about 9/11. And I've heard enough people make that argument in the once colonized world. Indeed, these implications, I think, are worth considering. How do we then recreate or begin to build a connection between principles and interests? And this is not a matter of the Greeks. This is the greatness of modern philosophy. This is what you find in Rousseau. This is what you find, in fact, you can find explicitly this in Rousseau in the beginning of the social contract, the great work of democracy, arguably the first great work of democracy. And it dominates the Enlightenment. How do we begin to connect principles and interests? Which criteria do you employ? And usually we begin from the moral standpoint. I would like to do it the other way around. And here I would like to sort of quote someone or use the categories of someone who was very famous in political science, but with whom I really never agreed on anything. And that's a former advisor to the State Department, very well-known character named Harold Laswell. And Harold Laswell spoke about politics in terms of who gets what, when, where, how, and why. I think if we begin to think of these categories seriously in moral terms, we can begin to talk about a set of criteria and a human rights policy which allows us to begin to make judgments on what's being done. One size does not fit all. This is ridiculous. To make an argument that what I do or what a government has to do in the Sudan is going to be the same as what a government has to do in Egypt or in ex-former Soviet states, that doesn't go very far. What we need, though, is categories which allow us to begin to see and judge the particular policy that's pursued. Addressing genocide and human rights abuses has led the United States to advocate shifts in policy, structural reform, or even regime change. Exactly the same three things which are often shown themselves at odds in the Green Movement in Iran. Will nation building or the attempt to foster democracy make the United States appear as an imperialist and its new ally as its puppet? That is the what. You know? Important in choosing a strategy, what strategy, and most important in legitimating its ethical character is, in my view, the ability to show that the talk of human rights is not merely a cover for interest, and for particular interests intent upon securing and legitimating powerful lobbies. If you think of the most horrible criticism of the Iraq policy from the standpoint of the United States domestically, we think of Bechtel, we think of Halliburton, we think of XE. How do we make sure, in the eyes of our own citizens and others, that that kind of legitimation doesn't occur? Can we carry on then in such a way that there is a ethical purpose that transcends the particular lobbies that can be brought to, whose concerns were brought to bear? That's the what. Now the question is when. When is it appropriate to intervene, to cut to the chase? The most obvious answer is when national interests are at stake. But this kind of determination, as we see in Iraq, is not always easy to assess. It requires not only the ability to estimate costs, but the existence of a democratic consensus for action. It's almost unbelievable that, let alone the American people, Congress should have asked for detailed information about the costs and objectives of U.S. policy in Libya. I mean, just think about what that means. Congress has asked the president to provide information about an action that's already being undertaken because the Congress doesn't know what is being done. That's a staggering statement. We've heard sort of much joking even about, Admiral Fallon brought this up, about leaving Afghanistan, leaving Iraq. Well, there better be some kind of exit strategy, because if there isn't, and if there isn't from the outset, then in the eyes of the rest of the world and from the standpoint of human rights, whatever the United States is going to do in the name of human rights is going to appear as imperialist. Yeah? Because that word still has meaning, even though it's not popular anymore. Then there's the question of where. We've gone through what, we've gone through when, now what about where? So where is American policy being implemented? Here, knowledge of empirical conditions, as Professor Esposito and a number of other people have pointed out, is really crucial. It's a prerequisite for any successful policy. The shifting justification for the Iraqi invasion that included claims concerning the existence of non-existent weapons of mass destruction is a case in point. I was in Iraq 2 months before the war. I was asked with a delegation. We went to one of the places that Hans Blix's group visited 3 times. That was at a university. This was where it was really thought about that weapons, biological weapons, were to be constructed. Our group went in there, and what we saw was a chem lab that no decent high school in New York would accept. I mean, it's absurd, yeah? Morad Ekbal was with me on that. We knew right away that this couldn't be. This couldn't be. And yet we have this debate going on. Either there's irresponsibility or worse on the part of our policymakers. Sorry, actually, Morad was with me in Khartoum in Darfur. It's almost the same thing. Be that as it may. The question is always in any policy, if we're talking about national interest, is there really a consensus, and is the nation really at risk? You think about Iraq once again, and you think about the irresponsibility of the media, including the acceptable media, the media of record, the New York Times. I don't know how many of you remember Judith Miller, and this idiotic situation in which virtually an entire policy was influenced by a set of Iraqi exiles like Shalabi. And it was just a pure con man. Thomas Mann couldn't have written a better novel about a con man than what we actually went through. Again, irresponsibility on the part of our policymakers, or worse. Is it any different in Afghanistan? What interests, domestic and foreign, are actually being served by the action? There's no finessing the blunt reality, and it's worth thinking about with respect to Libya and other places. Bringing about human rights requires agents committed to human rights. What this means, in short, is we have to begin to ask, is there actually a movement, an organized movement in the country that we're thinking about, we're acting upon, that is in favor of pushing human rights? There's an old saying among, some of you may have some old Marxist leanings in the past. There's an old saying, the power of capital rests upon the degree of organizational and ideological unity of working people. That's true. I think that's true here today. But it's certainly true if you're going to talk about instituting a serious policy of human rights. You want to, what I was struck by in many of the discussions about Iran that I heard, which were really excellent, and I learned a great deal, was how little discussion there was about not the character or the analytics or the description of the opposition, but the organization and ideological unity of the opposition. If you don't have that, forget it. It's not happening anywhere. So, how is success to be estimated? The questions of ends and means is never extraneous or abstract. American standing in the world has suffered through cynical talk about collateral damage. I saw collateral damage, so did Morad in Khartoum. when President Clinton bombed that aspirin factory because he thought it was a terrorist cell, and not an apology was given to this day. It's an appalling situation. Well, we just had to do it. Why? Who cares? Lenin liked to say you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. Well, that's probably true, but it's also true that if you keep breaking eggs, you may wind up not with an omelet, but with a mess. And that seems to be the case with what happened in, thank you. That seems to be what happened in Iraq. It seems to be what's happening in Libya, and I fear it may happen with Iran. I think Professor Esposito's point here was very good. We expect gratitude for our forays into human rights and worry about the lives of our brave soldiers, which, well, we should. But too often we forget what the others pay. If you want to talk about human rights, it's not what we're doing, it's what the other people have to pay in costs. So perhaps we will get a democratic regime in Iraq. Maybe we will. But the cost, not the cost we pay, here's the cost. Between 600 to 800,000 dead in a country of 27 million, 5 times that much in wounded, thousands and hundreds of thousands in exile, ecological damage, more. Just check the Johns Hopkins study of 2006 and you get a sense. And the cost is paid by us. When you'd only think back to the words of other idealists at the time of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, we kill them in order to save them. I fear that that idea still holds good. A foreign policy means, predicated on human rights, means looking at the other and beginning to educate a kind of cosmopolitan sensibility. Somebody mentioned Hafez, I think, this young woman. When I think of Hafez, I don't just think of Hafez. I think of Goethe, who began the idea of world literature. Hafez, of course, wrote the Divan. Goethe wrote the West-East Divan. It's one of the great works of poetry in the Western tradition. Not one student I've ever had knows that poem, or that set of poems. It says something. And finally, we get to why. Here's the kicker. Why is this particular abuse of human rights being addressed? There are hundreds of wars. There are thousands of human rights abuses taking place. How egregious is this particular breach of human rights? How many people died in Gaza during the siege? Does anybody know? I'm sorry? 1,400. Probably you could get 1,400 dying in a day in the Congo, and nobody gives a good goddamn. That's the truth of the matter. One goes over one goes to Darfur, one goes to the Congo, one goes to places like this. The world looks very different from that standpoint when one's looking at the Middle East. And the kind of inflation that we make over these kind of issues, and the need for action now, the need for even economic, technological support and the like, now, it pales when one looks at Congo, when one looks at Darfur. Yeah, one size doesn't fit all. But that only makes the justification of the particular action more important. Indeed, what matters is less the ability to intervene everywhere than the ability to fashion a particular foreign policy in a particular circumstance that is prudent and that works to the benefit of the other, of the peoples involved. Mistakes are going to occur. Who gets what, when, where, how, and why? Those trying to create that constellation in a coherent way is difficult, very difficult. Politics is an art, it's not a science. Machiavelli knew that. But it's legitimate to demand of policymakers that they offer a plausible, not necessarily an absolute, only God offers the absolute, but a plausible connection between principles and interests and means and ends. That requires both transparency in the deliberation process and vigorous debate, open debate, not talk about national security, the cover for every kind of oppression. When it comes to human rights and American foreign policy, in short, there's no finessing a basic reality, I think. And that is, democracy is what democracy does. Thank you very much.